Victorian Period by Ashley and Felicia. In this presentation, we are going to discuss what the time period of the Victorian era was like, Sonnet 43, Oliver Twist, Jane Eyre, popular writing forms, and literary techniques.
The time period was from 1832 to 1901 and is known as the Victorian Period. A few major events that took place were the Education Reform, Industrial Revolution, and reign of Queen Victoria. The Education Reform took place due to high interest in reading, writing, and arithmetic. Scientists such as Darwin helped to lead this with his theory of evolution. Before the Educational Reform, the school systems in England were not for everyone. During the education reform, the schools became more state-funded through taxes, which meant that students ages 5 through 13 could attend if they paid $2 a week, which in their time was the equivalent of 1 pence. During the Industrial Reform, the use of steam-powered machines led to massive increases in numbers of factories. Thousands of people were moving into the cities to get these jobs, which caused living conditions to decrease because of overflow. Queen Victoria is associated with Britain's great age of industrial expansion, economic progression, and especially empire. At her death, it was said Britain had a worldwide empire on which the sun never set. Here is a time period resource in which you could play a game where you will take the life of a Victorian, either male or female, and live a day in their life. For more detailed information about Queen Victoria, click here. A few major writers included Charles Dickens, Charlotte Bronte, Elizabeth and Robert Browning, Emily Bronte, George Eliot, Lewis Carroll, Oscar Wilde, and
Rudyard Kipling.
A few major literary themes that were present in most works of literature were social unrest, realism, sublimity, social status, pathetic fallacy, and judgment. Click here for a video of some common themes that were obvious during Victorian period. During this time period, the Victorian age showed severe characteristics of economic depression, high unemployment, terrible working and living conditions, and soaring bread prices. Reforms such as feminism and democracy were present in society. It was also the age of Darwin. This time period was full of doubt in religion. This was due mostly to the theory of evolution that Darwin presented.
The first literary work that we're going to look at is Sonnet 43 by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. This is one of the major quotes from this sonnet. This work of literature is a sonnet, which is a form of poetry. In this sonnet, the speaker spends the entirety of it telling of how much she loves her beloved and all the ways that she loves him. Elizabeth was born and grew up in England. She wrote and published many works during her lifetime. In 1844, she published a book simply entitled Poems. Her book caught the attention of Robert Browning, and he wrote her a letter to tell her how much he liked it. After this, the two continued their correspondence. They wrote 574 letters over a period of 20 months, and they fell in love. The two then eloped in 1846 and settled together in Florence, Italy. Many of Elizabeth's sonnets, including Sonnet 43, were written to Robert before they were married. Sonnet 43 connects to the popular literary theme of the Victorian period of sublimity. She admires her beloved so much, and she sets him up high on a pedestal. The speaker takes her love for her beloved, and she raises it to the spiritual level. He is of great and high worth to her in that respect. The writing of this time period was often very descriptive. It was very thick and full. Sonnet 43 matches up with this in that it is very descriptive as she describes her love for her beloved.
The second work of literature that we will be looking at is Oliver Twist, written by Charles Dickens. "Please, sir, I want some more." This is one of the most famous quotes from this work of art. Oliver Twist is a novel. During the Victorian Age, novels were becoming more and more popular than in previous eras. In this novel, Oliver becomes an orphan after the death of his mother. He gets tossed and moved from place to place. He gets into the wrong crowd and begins pickpocketing, even though he knows this is wrong. In the end, though, Oliver ends up with a wealthy and good family who loves him. This, to him, is a much better place than where he was before. Charles Dickens was born February 7, 1812. His father was imprisoned for debt in 1824. This caused the 12-year-old Dickens to be taken from school to work at a boot blackening factory to earn his money to help support his family. The poverty and abandonment Dickens felt as a child became a huge influence on his later outlook on social reform and the world he created in his books. A common literary theme in this work is social class. Oliver Twist shows how artificial and shallow class systems really are. He represents the idea of we are all the same on the inside. It also shows just how terrible the class systems were in this time period. People just ignored the people that were less fortunate because they themselves were satisfied. The novel written in the Victorian period was often realistic, thickly plotted, crowded with characters, and long. Oliver Twist fits all of these characteristics that were common of the era.
The third literary work that we're going to be looking at is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. It is in vain to say human beings ought to be satisfied with tranquility. They must have action, and they will make it if they cannot find it. This is a quote from the novel Jane Eyre. In the novel, Jane is an orphan living with her aunt, Mrs. Reed, who is cruel and terrible to her. At the age of 10, Jane is sent to a boarding school called Lowood. She spends the rest of her education there, and after finishing, she teaches for 2 more years before finding a job as a governess at Thornfield, working for Mr. Rochester, teaching a young French girl named Adele. She soon finds herself falling for Mr. Rochester, but on their wedding day, tragedy strikes when she discovers that he has a living wife who is a lunatic. Jane does not marry Rochester and leaves Thornfield in the cover of the night. She is forced to live on the streets until the Rivers take her in. Then Jane's uncle dies and leaves her £20,000, which she shares with her cousins, who actually turn out to be the Rivers. St. John River decides to go to India to be a missionary and wants Jane to come along with him as his wife, but she refuses. After St. John leaves, Jane goes looking for Rochester, and she discovers that Thornfield has been burned down by Bertha, who also died in the fire. When Jane finds Rochester, she discovers that he is now blind and crippled. After rebuilding their relationship, the two get married. 2 years later, Rochester gains sight again in one eye and is able to see their firstborn son when he is born. Charlotte was born in 1816 into a family of 5 girls and 1 boy. Soon after, Charlotte's mother dies of cancer, which forces Charlotte to have to live with her horrible aunt. Eventually, Mr. Bronte sent 4 of the children to charity school, which was equally as horrible, where 2 of her sisters died from illnesses because they weren't taken care of well. When Charlotte got older, she became a teacher and a governess. Also, she did fall in love with a married man, but nothing happened between them. Then, at 38, Charlotte married Reverend Arthur Nichols. This work of literature also relates to the theme of social class. It is shown in how Jane's social class status provides obstacles for her in her life. However, it also shows that social class is not everything, and it can be overcome. Again, the novels of the Victorian time period were often plotted thickly, long, full of characters, and realistic. Jane Eyre also fits into these characteristics very well for the Victorian time period.
Two of the most popular writing forms during the Victorian era were novels and poetry. A few well-known writers of novels were Charles Dickens, Emily Bronte, and Charlotte Bronte. Lord Tennyson, Robert Browning, and Elizabeth Browning were well known during this era for their poetry. Two major literary techniques that were often used during this era were realism and naturalism. For realism, this was a time period where literature focused on what was going on around them in their everyday life and the advances in the world around them. Naturalism was a technique that strived to show the pure thought of what was reality for the writer, and what usually had a focus on the lower to middle class. For a few fun facts about the Victorian era, click here.